Good day, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. Today we're continuing with our Average Folks in the Afterlife series, number 12, I think this is. And we're continuing with A Soul's Journey by Peter Richelieu. Exactly where we left off in the last episode. My guide now told me to hold his hand again and join with him in willing to pass from this second sphere to the third. I did as I was told. At once the scene that surrounded us started to dim and gradually give place to a new one. Our surroundings were now quite different, for we were standing in an open space, surrounded by what appeared to be dozens of small woods or coppices. There's a word I don't hear often, coppices. If you can imagine a gigantic park with trees everywhere, with glades and dells intermingled with clumps of trees, it will help you visualize the scenery. There is nothing quite like it in our world, but I should imagine that from above it would appear as if one were over a gigantic Sherwood forest. In many cases, the open spaces were several square acres in extent, varying from a glade measuring perhaps 3 acres to open spaces covering what I would estimate to be a 50-acre field. All these glades were very picturesque, as everywhere there were flowering shrubs, while daffodils and forget-me-nots bloomed in profusion in the green grass. There were no houses to be seen at first, but later I saw odd houses, very large ones too, resembling the huge halls or manor houses that one finds in England and which in the old days were inhabited by aristocrats or squires. We glided along, and I saw that in many of these open spaces, groups were congregated. We approached one of these groups and found that there were perhaps 100 people watching an artist painting a picture on a canvas that measured about 50 by 30 feet. 50 by 30 feet. They were obviously enthralled by what they were watching, for no one took any notice of us as we joined the group. The artist was not using brushes, but he had in his hand a long stick resembling a fishing rod, and as he pointed the stick at different parts of the canvas, a picture appeared, first in rough outline, then later in detail. As he painted, the artist spoke from time to time, explaining what he was creating. He made quite clear the impression that he wished those watching to have, and on one occasion he rubbed out part of the painting. I cannot use any other word, for as he pointed the stick, a portion of the picture was erased, and explained that his previous thought form had not been sufficiently detailed to get the effect he wanted. Again he seemed to concentrate. The rod moved up and down, across and over. A new detail which blended in with the rest of the painting immediately took form. The second attempt at once emphasized the point he had made a minute or so before. I could not understand much of what the painter was talking about, for it was couched in technical terms only comprehensible to a brother artist. I was told that the artist was one of the great painters of the past. My guide stated that an artist would paint because the urge which made him do so when in the world continues after death. He does not have to use brushes and paint at this level, because he is able to express himself in color merely by projecting the thought. The fluidic astral matter answers to the thought form, and the picture appears, as if by magic, as the thought develops. Although the canvas was huge compared with the pictures we have seen in our galleries in our world, it was in no way cumbersome to create a picture of that size at the astral level. When merely by concentrating on a particular part of the canvas, the picture within the mind of the artist came to life. I cannot describe the glorious colors of which that picture was composed, for we have no words to describe the many in-between colors that were used. When I mentioned that I saw at least 30 different shades of a color, which if I described any one of them I would have to call red, you will realize how impossible it is to give anything but a very incomplete description of what I saw quite clearly. My guide explained that many of the great painters of the past who were still at the astral level lived in this sphere, and that they spent their lives creating in the thought form of pictures the ideas which their minds were filled. At the same time, the artist taught any who cared to watch and listen to them the methods adopted in making the pictures. I was told that it took only a few hours to create one of these huge pictures, and it often happened that the artist, having finished one, started at once to create another. But does the first one fade once the artist has withdrawn his attention from the canvas? I asked. No, replied my friend. It remains just as you see it now, so long as anyone is looking at it. You see, once a picture is created in astral matter, that picture remains static for anyone to see, so long as a single thought is concentrated on it. When all thought is withdrawn from it, it gradually disintegrates into the main astral atmosphere and is lost forever, or until a new thought creates it again as a new picture. I watched until the picture was finished, fascinated by the skill of the creator and the results achieved. When the artist had moved away and was talking to some of the crowd who had been sitting round watching him, I saw that several of the other watchers, obviously students of art, started to create something similar for themselves, taking the master picture as their pattern. I still watched and saw immediately the tremendous difference between their efforts and those of the great painter. It was explained to me that the reason for such a great difference was the lack of knowledge of the student compared with the knowledge of the master. The students were unable to express in clear thought what they wanted to appear on the canvas, so the results were decidedly amateurish. Obviously, the canvas would only exhibit what they were able to express in thought, and I saw very clearly why this was so. Even in the picture galleries of this world, if one looks at a picture, it often happens that one is able to feel something of what the artist has endeavored to express. Such feeling is emphasized 1,000 times at the astral level, and looking at the great painting, I knew without any shadow of a doubt what this artist wished to express in color and form. We moved off and saw many groups surrounding individuals doing similar work, but as the country was slightly undulating, it was practically impossible to see any two of them at one time. In one of the valleys where a slow-moving stream trickled along, there was a group seated on its bank, seemingly doing nothing. As we approached, however, I realized this group was not watching a creative artist, but was producing sounds resembling a beautiful symphony played by one of our famous orchestras. I did not hear anything until we got quite close to the group, but then I found that the surrounding air was filled with the most beautiful music I had ever heard. In the center of a group was a man whose face seemed familiar to me, yet I knew that I had never met him in real life. I asked my guide who he was, and he whispered, "That is the celebrated Johann Strauss." At that moment he was demonstrating how the sound of trickling water can be expressed in music. I remembered that it was Strauss who had composed the Blue Danube, and this music seemed to have much of the lilt found in that hackneyed but beautiful waltz. It was even more beautiful still, I should say. While I stood enthralled, I saw on the opposite bank of the stream what seemed to be ethereal figures, who in some way were part of the symphonic poem that I heard. My friend told me to look at these new people for, quote, "These are members of that parallel evolution I have told you about, the Deva kingdom." "But what are they doing?" I asked, "and why do they look so different from the crowds that are on our side of the stream?" It was explained that they looked different because indeed they were different. They are more ethereal because, being part of a different evolution, their bodies are different, and although made of astral matter, are at the same time less concrete than our astral bodies. I was told that these were some of the music devas, those beings who live and express themselves through sound, and that they were helping the composer, who was seated on our side of the stream, to express himself as he wished to do. Just how they helped I cannot say, for they never spoke, but it seemed to concentrate on the creator of the music, and through their thoughts enable him to express in more and more detail what he endeavored to create in sound. Volume of sound was there, and every note clearly heard, but I found that when we passed from the group to a distance of perhaps 50 yards, nothing was to be heard at all. It is difficult to describe these members of the Deva kingdom in words that are understandable. Their forms were beautiful, but as they moved, they seemed to vaporize, and when they became still again, they were once more quite definite in shape. I think I can describe it best by saying that the bodies seemed to be made of mist, which only held together in a concrete way when the individuals remained more or less still. We went over to the opposite bank, but as we approached these people, they seemed to glide away, rather like shy animals. They had no fear in us, but did not invite contact at all, and I felt as if we approached them with the intent to communicate with them. How that would be done, I had no idea then. They would simply have vanished into thin air. my Indian friend that this impression was in a fairly good way accurate. On my guide beckoning me to follow him, we moved on. Soon I saw that he was making for one of the large buildings, which I had taken to be a huge manor house. As we drew nearer, I saw that the architecture was very beautiful indeed, and deep French windows overlooked the surrounding countryside. Spacious lawns gradually sloped away from the house, which was situated on the top of a rise. Flowers and flowering shrubs bloomed on all sides, and in the distance, perhaps 10 miles away, the sea could be seen if one looked carefully. It was a delightful spot. I wondered who lived here and for what purpose. We came down to earth on the terrace and entered the wide doors that led into a spacious hall, furnished as I would have expected it to be, but with one remarkable difference, that in the hall there were actually small trees and plants, principally roses I noticed, blooming indoors with the roots growing through the floor. There was no artificiality in this. In fact, one felt one was in an indoor garden, and the results to the eye were very pleasing indeed. Marvelous that, isn't it? Growing through the floor. Wonderful stuff. No one seemed to be about and there were no sounds of occupation, but my guide immediately led me to one of the doors that opened from the hall, and as the door opened, sounds of music met my ear. There was only one occupant of the room, and he was playing a grand piano in a way which showed that he was no mean exponent of the art. He took no notice of us, but continued to play, and we listened, fascinated by the power of the musician over his instrument. There were a few very inviting easy chairs in which we sat down, and perhaps for a quarter of an hour the playing continued. As time passed, I seemed to recognize a similarity in this music to the Chopin preludes, and in a whisper to my friend I asked who this musician was. "Do you not recognize him?" he replied. "That is the famous Chopin, who is still expressing his great soul through the medium of sound in exactly the same way as he used to do when he was alive." You will notice, though, he does not look delicate here, for when he was in the world he suffered much, and for a great part of his lifetime was not a fit man. Now all that is changed. Here fatigue cannot trouble him, and he produces more and more beautiful music, which at times he allows other musicians to hear. At this level there are concerts all the time. Thus there is never any difficulty in attending these functions if you are really interested, and are able to appreciate the beauty in nature that the musician is endeavoring to express in sound. Many concerts of all types of music in the astral plane. All types. Just a small note. I looked at the performer more closely and found that I was unable to recognize any resemblance to the likeness of the great musician which I had seen. But in my memory of these were vague, and I probably had not studied them very carefully. He stopped playing after a time and turned round to us, in no way perturbed or annoyed by our presence. He assumed that we were music lovers, and so explained that as what he had been trying to express, and although he used some technical terms, I was fascinated by what he said. He emphasized that in his opinion every sound was a description either of color or movement. Progressions and blendings of chords were sound pictures of beautiful gardens, and where cadenzas appeared one should immediately feel the presence of a slowly moving stream, perhaps between two perfectly laid out gardens, and tried to see the picture that the musician was endeavoring to express. I, who considered myself musical, at once realized how little I knew of the true art, and resolved that after death I would be one of those people who took up the study of music in a big way. It is unfortunate that, in the world, these masters of music are in most cases entirely outside the scope and opportunity of the average man who has to earn a living. Now, don't forget, this book was, I think we've decided it was published in the early 50s. May have been written slightly before that, obviously post-World War II. But let us remember the differences between the average person then, even in the advanced Western countries, as we say. Probably only had access to radio. And if you lived in a large town or city, you could go to concerts. But our access to music is incredibly wide and varied compared to them. And as you know, almost anything can be seen on YouTube. Anything at all. So just a small point to consider. That's the time period we're looking at. And although there is no real time in the astral, when people visit from the physical, out of body, as this chap is, they are introduced to levels where how shall we say, the cultural expectations of the recently deceased are met. How does that sound? We left as we had come, without any official leave-taking, and as we withdrew, Chopin turned towards his piano and recommenced to play. As we closed the door and we were again in the passage, no sound whatever came through the door. There was only the sound of birds, many of which in diverse colours flitted about, not only in the garden, but also indoors. My friend told me that this huge house was one of the great art schools which exist at this level of the astral world, and that hundreds of the permanent inhabitants of this world spend much of their time in learning something of the art in which they are particularly interested. I was told that tuition was always available, for all the great masters are willing to teach those who are anxious to learn, and that the opportunity is there at all times, for there is no night or day, and fatigue does not enter into one's calculations. Well, we seem to have a computer pause there. I hope that wasn't too annoying for you. But surely, I asked, people do not carry on studying and practicing day and night, week after week, month after month, and year after year in this way? Yes, they do. And as I have told you, they do not get tired, nor does time hang heavily when they are interested and enthralled in what they're doing. If you analyze your reactions at a physical level, you will find that time never drags when you are doing what you want to do. Usually fatigue enters in and you have to stop. And even though you are enjoying what you are doing, but here that does not apply, as one does not get tired, and there is no time as we understand that term. You do not have to get home for dinner, you have no wife waiting for you, and you have no duties or responsibilities in any way. Those limitations just do not exist at the astral level, so the man or woman carries on with the work or relaxation that he or she desires, without any thought of how much time can be devoted to that particular form of study. My guide then told me that he had a little work to do and politely asked my permission to leave me for a short while. Go where you will, he said, and no one will interfere with you, and I suggest you wander in and out of the different rooms, for I can assure you, you will not meet with any hostile reception. The building is very like similar ones which exist here, and it would well worth your while for you to see more of what is done in such places. I shall return when I have finished my private work, and do not think you will be bored whilst I am away. From the outside I had seen that the building had at least 3 stories, so I decided I would explore a little, and as he suggested. To start with, I went into some of the lower rooms. In one I found a sculptor with a class of pupils, explaining how a particular curve could be obtained. I stood a while listening to his discourse and some of his pupils without speaking, and they smiled at me as I listened, obviously not objecting in the least to my presence. In another room a quartet was practicing. In another a single violinist was going over a particular passage with a score of music in front of him. It was very similar to an academy such as one I had seen in the world, but with the great difference that there was no fuss or hurry and that all forms of art were represented. Also, it was very noticeable that the people concerned, although quite seriously studying, were so obviously happy and not tense in any way. Later I wandered upstairs, and here I had a very pleasant surprise. As I opened a door, and I noted with interest that one did open a door and not go through it as one did with physical doors. Yes, when you're at the astral level, and the door is at the astral level, you're vibrating at the same level. Therefore, you open the door. It gets more complicated as you go on, but for that level, that is true. And went into one of these rooms. I saw a girl seated on a settee next to an open grand piano. She had a piece of music in her hand, which she was studying. As she entered, she looked up, and at once I knew her. It was Daphne Hillier, who I'd last seen in England in '35 when I met her at a golf club. The man who was my opponent that day knew her and me intimately. He introduced us and we soon got into conversation. I saw her many times during my leave and we got to know each other extremely well. I had thought several times of asking her to marry me, for I imagined I was in love with her, but somehow I did not. For one reason, I did not feel I had yet enough money to marry on. Also, I wanted to get to the top of my profession before I accepted the responsibility of a wife. I returned to Ceylon and for 2 years we corresponded regularly. Then it all ended by her contracting pneumonia, and to my great regret, her mother wrote to me to say that she had died. I wrote a letter of sympathy and gradually lost touch with the family. And now there was Daphne before me, seemingly very much alive and looking just the same as when I had seen her last, but with an even happier expression. In fact, her whole face radiated joy and contentment, and some of the joy, I flattered myself, was at seeing me. Daphne, my dear, is it really you? Yes, it is I, she said. But what are you doing here? You haven't left the old world yet, I know. So what has brought you here? I tried to explain to her something of what had happened and why I was here. She said she was surprised to see me because although most people who are evolved at all wander on the astral plane during the time that their bodies are asleep and recuperating for the following day, yet it is not common for living people to visit the third sphere of the astral world. In most cases, they do not know how to get there, and very few know of the existence of these different levels. But darling, she said, now that you are here, you will be able to come again, and we must see lots of each other in the future. There is much I can show you. Although you never asked me to marry you when I was alive, I knew that you loved me, and I love you too. Oh dear, touching, isn't it? My goodness. I realized then that it had not seemed strange at all for her to address me as darling, for though I had often called her that in the old days and she me, and although that was all several years ago, it all came back in a flash, and I felt again the same draw towards her, the same thrill at being in her company, as I had felt in the old days. This is wonderful, I said, and certainly will not be my fault if I do not see you a great deal in the future. Perhaps you will be able to help me in this, for I do not know whether I could get here on my own, even though it all seemed so easy this time when I had a guide to help. I told her about my efforts in the recent past and how apart from my first astral journey, I had not been able to bring anything through, even though I tried very hard to do so. In the future, I shall want to remember what we say and do. I wonder if I shall be able to do that. His not remembering is covered in the sections that I haven't read. As I say, I can't read the whole thing. We'll be here for years. It's not that long a book, but still, we're well into it. So, I think maybe we'll finish there for today. And right in the middle of the romance, which does continue. It's an interesting evolution. And, another little skip there. Apologize for that. Interesting evolution. And I wish you all, until the next part, I wish you all farewell, au revoir.